My phone hasn't stopped ringing for 11 minutes. I count because counting keeps my hand steady around the coffee mug. Constance's name flashes across the screen for the fourth time, then Nathan's, then a number I don't recognize. Somewhere behind those calls, in a country club ballroom 200 miles from this lake, my husband's family is watching the future they built collapse in real time. They think I did this to them. They think I planned it. What they don't know is that I've been waiting 6 weeks for a sealed envelope to catch up with a lie that's 12 years old. I'm a leaner, 47, and up until a few months ago, I was married into one of the wealthiest families in the state. This is the story of how a $2 million payoff meant to erase me quietly became the thing that finally let me exist out loud. I let the phone ring itself quiet. It's a Saturday morning in early June, the kind of morning that used to mean nothing more than opening the windows and letting the lake air move through the house. I'm sitting at the small pine table in the cabin I bought for myself on Cedar Lake, Michigan, 3 years ago. Back when I still thought I might need somewhere to retreat to for a weekend now and then. I never imagined I'd be living here full time. I never imagined a lot of things that turned out true. The coffee's gone lukewarm. Through the window, the water sits flat and silver under a sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. Somewhere across that water, 300 guests are gathered at Ashford Country Club, dressed in linen and pearls, waiting for Harold Whitfield to hand his company to his oldest son. There's a string quartet. There's a cake with a small gold W on top, because apparently even a baby who hasn't been born yet needs a monogram. I know all this because my attorney, Diane Foster, told me the itinerary 2 days ago in the flat, careful voice she uses when she's trying not to let her opinions show. Diane has represented me for 11 years, and I've never heard her sound as tired as she did on that call. "You don't have to go," she said. "I wasn't planning to," I told her. The phone lights up again, Constance. I let it ring 3 times before I answer. Because there's a version of me, the one who spent 23 years learning how to make herself smaller in that family's presence, who would have picked up on the first ring. That version doesn't live here anymore. Eleanor, where are you? Somewhere you paid me quite a lot of money to disappear from, I say. 6 weeks ago, if memory serves. There's noise behind her, scraping chairs, a man's voice rising and falling, someone saying the word auditor like it's a curse. I picture the ballroom, the flowers wilting under too many bodies, the quartet faltering mid-phrase because nobody told them to stop. Bree somewhere near the front in a pale blue dress, one hand resting on a belly that's become, in 6 months, the single most valuable asset the Whitfield family owns. "There's been a complication," Constance says. "Something with a transfer. I need you to come explain it." "Explain what exactly?" "The $2 million, Eleanor. Someone at the bank is asking where it came from." I look at the thin folder sitting on the table in front of me. I already know what's inside. I've known for 3 days. "That's strange," I say. "I was under the impression it came from your family's pockets. Isn't that what the paperwork said?" Silence. Then Nathan's voice, sharp and close, wrestling the phone from his mother. "Eleanor, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Nathan. I've been sitting at a lake all morning. I didn't write whatever letter just arrived. I didn't call whatever bank flagged whatever it flagged. All I did was wait for the truth to show up on its own schedule instead of mine." "You knew," he says. "It isn't a question." "I knew what was possible. You're the one who decided to believe the rest." I can hear Bree crying somewhere behind him, a high, performative sound I recognize from the night I signed those papers. Harold's voice cuts through, demanding someone call legal. Gregory says nothing at all, which tells me more than anything else said in that room. "Come to the club," Nathan says. "Fix this." "There's nothing broken that I can fix," I say, "and nothing here that belongs to me anymore." I hang up before he can answer. To understand what's happening in that ballroom right now, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the night they called me to the house. The night I learned exactly how little I was worth to them, and exactly how much they still didn't know. Nathan came home at 11 that night still in his suit, tie loosened, and said it the way you'd announce a merger. Bree's pregnant. I was sitting up in bed with a book I wasn't really reading. I set it down slowly, gave myself half a second to arrange my face. 23 years of marriage teaches you things about timing. Congratulations, I said and meant it to sting, though I'm not sure it landed. It's a boy, he said, like the sex of the child settled something. The family needs to move quickly before this gets out. By the family asterisk, he meant his family. By move quickly asterisk, I'd learn within the hour he meant me. They sent the family car for me that same night, black, silent, as if I were already a piece of business to be transported rather than a wife to be spoken with. The house on Birchwood Lane was lit up like a magazine shoot when I arrived. Constance sat in a chair positioned like a throne. Harold stood by the fireplace and didn't rise. Nathan stood too close to Bree on the sofa. Edmund Cross, the family attorney, sat at the low table with a leather folder already open. Bree had one hand resting on her stomach, though she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks along. It was a gesture, not a fact. I noticed how practiced it looked. Edmund slid the folder toward me before anyone said hello. $2 million, 7 days to vacate the house, permanent silence on the affair, no contact with press. A full release of any claim to marital assets, no objection ever to Nathan's remarriage. I read every line twice while the room watched me, and I thought, if they expected tears, they were about to be disappointed in a way that would cost them. This is more than most women your age could hope to walk away with, Constance said, folding her hands like she was doing me a kindness. Bree let a tear slide down her cheek right on cue, and Constance patted her knee without looking, already choosing sides in a war that hadn't started for me yet. I don't want to hurt you, Nathan said, and for one second I almost believed there was something underneath the words. But this is the family's future. Are you certain it's yours? I asked. The room went still the way rooms do right before someone raises their voice. Are you going to insult the mother of my child in this house? Nathan snapped. Bree cried harder. I didn't argue. Arguing with a room that's already decided the ending only wastes your breath. Instead, I made my own requests. The full $2 million wired that same night, not staggered. Every document notarized before I left. Explicit language that the payment did not touch any business shares held in my name. No terms alterable after signing. Edmund skimmed the shares clause and told the room my holdings were negligible, a leftover formality. Constance, eager to be done with me, agreed without argument. I signed. Bree smiled like a woman who'd just won something permanent. Nathan exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for days. Constance told me she knew I'd do the sensible thing. You never actually knew me, I told her, and watched it land somewhere behind her eyes. The money hit my account before midnight, exactly as I demanded. I sat at my kitchen table for 6 more days going through the wire details, with the kind of attention I used to bring to auditing the company's quarterly filings. Back when Nathan still asked for my opinion, instead of assuming I had none. Receipt, routing number, timestamp, fund of origin. It hadn't come from Constance's personal account, or Harold's. It came from the Whitfield Legacy Trust, the fund reserved by charter for a asterisk confirmed asterisk future heir. I sat with that fact for a long time. Then I called Deanne. They just paid me, I told her, with money set aside for a child who hasn't been proven to belong to this family yet. If you think that's where things got strange, you're only just getting started. I moved into a Holiday Inn off Route 23 the next morning. Chlorine and burnt coffee. Nothing like the 18 years I'd spent turning the house on Maple Ridge into a home. It felt right somehow, starting over somewhere that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Diane came by that afternoon with a legal pad and 2 coffees, and we spread the wire documents across the table. "This transfer needed board approval," she finally said. "I see a full approval record here, just Constance's signature and Edmund's countersign. For now, that's enough. But a payout from a fund meant for a confirmed heir, made before any heir exists, is going to raise questions eventually. Trusts like this usually carry an automatic audit trigger if funds move without full verification of the beneficiary." She looked up. "You also didn't give up your shares. Whatever they think they bought from you, it wasn't that." I hadn't told her yet why I wasn't panicking, why I'd sat in that living room and signed my name without raising my voice, while Bree performed her tears 3 feet away. Diane had represented me for over a decade, but there was one thing even she didn't know. I took an envelope out of my bag, its edges soft with age. "12 years old," I said, sliding it across the table. She opened it, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. 12 years earlier, Nathan had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, caught young before 40. He went through treatment quietly, terrified of what his father would think of a son whose own body had failed him. When it was over, the follow-up results came back clear on the cancer, but there was another line he read 3 times before he could speak: "Permanent infertility, a result of the treatment." Only 3 people ever knew: Nathan, myself, and Dr. Corinne Whitley, who'd cared for both of us for over a decade. He made me promise more than once his family would never learn it. In that family, a man who couldn't produce an heir was worth less than the furniture. "So when he told you Bree was pregnant," Diane said slowly, "you already knew it couldn't be biologically possible." "I knew what should have been impossible," I said. "But people believe what they need to believe." He convinced himself the old results didn't hold anymore. She told him it happened at a conference months ago. He wanted a son badly enough to stop asking questions he already knew the answers to. I didn't want to build anything on 12-year-old paper, though. I called Dr. Whitley that evening. She confirmed the old file still existed, but couldn't discuss it without Nathan's consent. Privilege doesn't dissolve just because a marriage does. But there was one thing she didn't need his consent to tell me. Years earlier, during our own fertility treatments together, I'd been named a joint party on those records. I still had legal access to part of that file. That same week, an email arrived from our old insurance provider. My name hadn't been removed from the family policy, yet in the confusion of the divorce filing. Buried in the notifications was a scheduling confirmation. Bree had booked a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Results in 3 weeks. I read that line 4 times. Diane warned me immediately not to interfere. Don't tip them off. Let them put the truth on paper themselves. She was right, even as some old, tired part of me wanted to walk into that house and lay it all out just to watch their faces change. I'd spent 23 years being patient with that family. I could manage 3 more weeks. Meanwhile, the Whitfield public relations machine started turning. Quiet statements through mutual friends. The marriage had been over in everything but paper for years. I'd taken the settlement out of self-interest. Nathan and Bree had found each other during a hard chapter and shouldn't be judged. A photographer was already booked for a next-generation announcement shoot. 3 days before I left the hotel, an old colleague from finance called. Legal had quietly asked her to adjust the approval date on my wire transfer to make it look like it cleared the board weeks earlier than it actually had. That was the moment I understood they weren't just hiding an affair anymore. They knew, on some level, the transaction wasn't clean. That night, a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. "If you want to know who really approved that money, Ask Gregory where he was the night Bree says she conceived. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The woman texted again the next morning, asking to meet. She introduced herself as Natalie Reyes, an audit assistant in the finance division. Someone I vaguely remembered from company holiday parties, always polite, always in the background. The kind of employee who notices everything and says nothing until she has a reason to. Over the next 2 days, she sent me pieces one at a time, like she was testing whether I could be trusted with the whole picture. Gregory had requested elevated access to trust fund records 6 weeks before Bree's pregnancy went public. He'd met with her multiple times outside any reasonable work schedule. There was a hotel charge in Cleveland under a name that didn't match anyone on the guest list for that week's supposed business trip. And Nathan hadn't even been in Cleveland the night Bree claimed the child was conceived. I checked it myself before I let myself believe it. I still had access to an old shared calendar nobody had removed me from. That night Nathan had been in Austin with Harold and 3 board members. Locked in meetings about a stalled development deal, I remembered him complaining about missing my birthday dinner because of it. Bree had been in Cleveland that same week. So had Gregory. Once I let myself look, smaller things came rushing back, things I'd noticed and dismissed for years. Gregory always defending Bree whenever Nathan criticized her work. Bree knowing details about deals that should have stayed inside Gregory's office. The two of them leaving the same holiday party within minutes of each other, more than once. Gregory pushing hardest of anyone for a fast, clean divorce. Diane was more cautious than I was. Don't let this become a story you're telling yourself because it's satisfying. We need documents. Speculation doesn't hold up in a courtroom, and it definitely doesn't hold up in that family. She was right. And I sat with the discomfort of not knowing instead of rushing toward a conclusion that felt too convenient. Meanwhile, the family moved forward as if none of this existed. A photographer was hired. Constance called that same week asking me to sign an additional document, waiving my voting rights in the company entirely. I refused. That stake exists because of this family, Constance said, clearly startled I hadn't just agreed. No, I said. I bought it with my own money back when the company was nearly bankrupt and nobody else wanted to risk a cent on it. Nobody gave me anything, Constance. I earned every percentage point. There was a long pause. 18%. That's what I still quietly held in a trust of my own, untouched by the divorce settlement, because I'd made certain of it the night I signed those papers. Without it, Nathan couldn't reach the voting threshold he needed to replace Harold as chairman. He called me an hour later furious. You tricked me. No, I said. You simply never read what I actually owned. If I had known what was waiting on that recorder, I might have braced myself differently. I didn't. That evening, Natalie finally agreed to meet in person at a quiet diner off the interstate. She slid a manila envelope across the table, a copy of the trust's approval log, the Cleveland hotel records, and a small digital recorder. I pressed play right there in the booth, my coffee going cold. It was Gregory's voice, low and confident, the way men get when they think no one important is listening. We just need Nathan to believe the baby is his until the transfer of power is finalized. Bree's voice quieter. And a leaner, $2 million will make her disappear. I sat very still, listening to my own erasure being planned in real time by 2 people I'd once trusted enough to invite into my home. There was more ice in a glass, a door closing, and then Bree again, colder this time. And once Nathan has the company, what do we do with him? 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the Whitfield family threw the kind of party they'd always been good at: white tablecloths, rehearsed smiles. Every detail built to tell a story about who they were rather than who they actually were. I wasn't there. I'd chosen the lake instead. Diane described it to me afterward, piece by piece. The guest list read like a who's who: board members, investors, banking partners, old money friends who'd known Harold since his own father ran the company. The agenda was simple and triumphant. Announce Bree was carrying a boy, announce Nathan's engagement, have Harold formally hand over the company, secure board approval for a new development phase, present the unborn child as the living symbol of the family's future. I'd spent that same morning with Diane at my kitchen table, going through 3 documents she'd filed the day before: a notice preserving my shareholder rights, a request for an internal audit of the trust transaction, a motion to delay any vote on transferring executive control until that audit concluded. Timing matters, she'd told me. We don't stop them. We make sure the truth arrives at the worst possible moment for them to hide it. It arrived just before Harold was set to speak. An auditor from the trust's oversight firm walked into that ballroom uninvited and asked to speak with the board privately. Word moved through the room the way bad news always does: whispers, glances, sudden stiffness. The findings were simple and devastating. The $2 million disbursement had been drawn improperly from a fund reserved for a *verified heir. The approval signature showed signs of being added after the fact. Any transfer of executive power would need to pause until the identity of the future heir was formally confirmed. Almost the same moment, less than 10 minutes later, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope addressed to Nathan personally. The prenatal paternity results, 3 weeks in the making, had finally come back. Bree tried to intercept it. Nathan wouldn't let her. He opened it standing in front of nearly 300 people. The room went silent the way rooms go silent when something's broken that can't be put back together. Nathan had been excluded as the biological father. Constance called me within the minute, her voice sharp with panic. "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said, standing at my kitchen window watching the lake do what it always did, indifferent to everything happening 200 miles away. "I've been sitting here all morning." Nathan grabbed the phone, his voice cracking. "You knew. I knew what was impossible. I let you decide what you wanted to believe instead." Bree, according to Diane, insisted the test had to be flawed, some kind of lab error. Her voice rising toward hysteria in a room full of people dressed for a celebration. Gregory tried to slip toward the exit. Harold, moving faster than anyone expected from a 76-year-old man, physically blocked the door. The auditor clarified calmly that the confidence level on the results was extremely high, and that an expanded comparison panel indicated a close male relative of Nathan's was significantly more likely to be the biological father. Every eye in that ballroom turned to Gregory. He denied it too quickly, the way guilty men always do. That was when I sent Harold and Edmund the recording Natalie had given me. The one where Gregory told Bree they only needed Nathan to believe the child was his until the transfer of power was complete. Diane said Harold listened to the whole thing standing perfectly still in the middle of that ruined ballroom before he finally looked at his younger son. Nathan lunged at Gregory. Security stepped between them before it went further. Bree broke down completely and finally admitted what should have been obvious from the start. She'd slept with both brothers, but it was Gregory who'd helped her plan every step of what came after. 3 days later, the family called an emergency meeting at Whitfield Development Group headquarters. This time, for the first time in 23 years, I walked into that building not as anyone's wife, but as a shareholder with a claim they could no longer dismiss. The 14th floor conference room held more people than I'd ever seen gathered for a single crisis. Nathan sat at one end, jaw set, refusing to look at his brother. Gregory sat with his own attorney, a stranger to me, which told me everything about how far things had fractured. Constance looked smaller in her usual chair. Harold's face was carved from something harder than I'd ever seen. Bree sat pale, her hands folded over a stomach that had become, in 1 week, evidence rather than triumph. Gregory tried first to shift the blame entirely onto Bree, his voice clipped and defensive, insisting he'd only ever offered her advice as a friend. Bree wasn't having it. "He promised he'd marry me," she said, "once Nathan was pushed out of the company." The plan, once it came apart fully on that table, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Use the child to accelerate Nathan into the chairman's seat. Once he held power, Gregory would use financial irregularities he himself had helped create to force his brother out under a cloud of scandal. Bree would threaten to expose the affair if anyone resisted, and Gregory, positioned throughout as the reasonable, uninvolved brother, would step in to take control himself. The $2 million had been the opening move, pulled from the trust specifically to remove me from the marriage before I could interfere. What none of them had accounted for was that I still held 18% of the company, and with it, the standing to demand a special audit. I laid out what I wanted without raising my voice, because I'd learned a long time ago that calm carries further in a room like that than anger ever could. A public correction, no more implying I'd taken a payout for silence. My confidentiality agreement rewritten so it could never again be used to bury wrongdoing. The $2 million reclassified as a legitimate personal settlement, drawn from Nathan's and the family's own assets, with full repayment made to the trust. Gregory suspended pending investigation. Bree released from her position, her medical and maternity coverage fully protected. None of this was the child's fault. Nathan would not be appointed chairman. An independent director would run the company for at least a year, and I would keep my shares along with my seat on the board. Constance's composure finally cracked. "You're punishing us." "This is revenge. Revenge is wanting you to suffer," I said. "I only want you to stop using my name to cover up what you did." Nathan asked to speak with me privately for a moment, and I let him. Mostly because I wanted to see what was actually left of the man I'd married. He asked quietly if there had ever been a point where I'd tried to save our marriage. "I saved it for 23 years, I told him. "You just never noticed because I did it quietly." He admitted, in a voice stripped of its usual certainty, that he'd known for a long time his odds of fathering a child were nearly non-existent. But he'd wanted so badly to prove something to his father that he chose to believe Bree anyway. "You didn't love the baby," I said. "You loved what you thought the baby would prove about you." He had nothing to say to that. When the vote finally came, Harold refused to hand control to either son. He cast his vote for the independent director instead, his voice flat and final, a man closing a chapter he'd clearly been rewriting in his head all week. Every condition I'd laid out was approved without further argument. Afterward, in the hallway, Nathan caught up with me one last time. "After all this," he said, "you're still keeping the $2 million. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who'd once been my whole life. Now something closer to a stranger standing in a hallway. "No," I said. "I've decided to use it for something your family never understood. I never gave the money back to Nathan. The Whitfields repaid the trust from their own personal holdings, dollar for dollar, exactly as it should have been from the start. What I'd received that first night was legally and finally mine, clean, documented, no longer tangled up in anyone else's lie. I didn't buy a bigger house. I didn't buy a car meant to announce anything to anyone. Instead, I sat at the same pine table where this whole story had circled back to its beginning, and I started something with a name that came to me almost fully formed: the Fresh Start Fund. It exists for women over 45 starting over after everything they built quietly falls apart around them, after divorce, after financial control wielded like a weapon, after being pushed out of family businesses they helped build, After years spent raising children or supporting a spouse's career, only to re-enter a workforce that's forgotten they exist. Legal consultation, career retraining, short-term housing assistance, financial planning, counseling for the kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral. I kept my seat on the Whitfield Development Group board because 18% doesn't disappear just because a marriage does. And because someone needed to make sure the new independent director actually held to our terms. But I didn't go back to running things day to day. That chapter had already closed itself quietly over 23 years of me standing just behind the curtain. Nathan resigned as CEO 6 months later. He moved into a small apartment across town and started seeing a therapist, something I never once heard him consider necessary during our entire marriage. I don't know if it's helping him. I've stopped needing to know. Gregory was formally charged with financial misconduct, falsifying trust records, and misappropriating funds meant for a beneficiary who never existed. The case is still working through the courts. Bree gave birth to a healthy boy that autumn. The DNA results confirmed what the ballroom had already guessed: Gregory was the father. I don't hate the child. A baby doesn't answer for the lies that brought him into the world. Constance lost most of her influence within the company almost overnight, the way power always seems to when it turns out to have been built on something hollow. Harold restructured the trust entirely, placing it under independent oversight so no single family member could ever again decide alone who deserved to be called an heir. A year after that ballroom fell silent around a sealed envelope, I stood in the small office we'd rented for the fund's first real headquarters. Clean walls, good light, a row of chairs for women who'd arrived not knowing quite how to ask for help. The first woman who walked through that door was 56. A widow 3 months out from discovering her late husband had quietly left most of his estate to a second family she hadn't known existed. I sat down beside her instead of across from her, because I remembered what it felt like to be spoken to like a problem instead of a person. Starting over doesn't mean you've lost everything, I told her. Sometimes it just means you finally get to keep the one thing that was always actually yours. That evening, I drove back out to the lake. The old folder still sitting in a drawer I hadn't opened in months. I set a new one down beside it. My phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't Nathan. It wasn't Constance. It never is anymore. It was a message from one of our caseworkers. A woman we'd helped in March had just accepted a job offer, her first paycheck in 11 years. I smiled at that, alone in the quiet, the light going gold outside the window the way it does every evening around this time. They thought $2 million was the price of making me disappear. It turned out to be the money that finally let me show up again, not as anyone's wife, but as the woman I'd been putting off becoming for more than 20 years. If you were a leaner, would you have signed those papers and let the truth expose itself in its own time? Or would you have confronted Nathan the moment he walked through that door? I want to know where this story finds you tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because this is only the beginning of the stories we've got coming.